Hi winners, welcome you all to MDSCONQUER online finish line for paper 1. Now the topic of discussion is dye materials. So before going into the present topic, I would like to thank my HOD Dr. Girija Sazan and my guide Dr. T. Rambabu and my junior Dr. Surya Madri for helping in making this PPT. So my task is to finish this in less than 5 minutes. Okay, so how well we can approach towards the particular question called as dye materials in your paper 1. So coming to the contents, basic introduction, definitions, requirement of dye material. Okay, there are 6 to 7 dye materials that are materials used in dye preparation, and you're going to talk about each and every dye material, in which we are going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Dye systems is another question which we'll be discussing in the next video, and a proper conclusion with good references. So this is our task for dye material. So if you're clear with the contents, it is easy to frame your answer in a proper way. So first of all, you need to write about the definition of dye. What is dye? You need to write a proper definition from a standard textbook, and it is mandatory that you have to quote the textbook name at the definition, because as you start with definition, the definition should be perfect and a proper coding will give a very positive impression. So once you're done with this, you need to write about the classifications. Okay, so there are classifications. Method of placement, it is direct dye, indirect dye, and the amount of tooth replacing, it can be intracoronal or extracoronal. You can add this reference, which is a star reference for this particular question. Then you can write about the differences between the direct and indirect fabrication basing upon the question. Okay, if it is just for 5 marks or 7 marks, I feel you can just write the classification and just move to the dye material, and individually you need to describe all 5 or 6 dye materials. But writing this direct and indirect fabrication differences is going to consume some time. So basing upon the questions, if it's a 10 marks question, so it is mandatory that you have to write about the direct and indirect fabrications too. So an extension of this direct and indirect fabrications, when you have to go for a direct fabrication and when you have to go for an indirect fabrication. The next about the requirements, the basic requirements of dye material. So all these 7 are the basic requirements of the dye material. It should be economical, it should be easy to use, it should have a good color so that you can contrast the finish lines, it should have a high strength and abrasion resistance, it should reproduce the fine details and sharp margins, accuracy and dimension stability. All these are the common basic requirements of any material which is specific to dye material here. Then comes the material that are used for making dyes. The most common is gypsum products, which is type 4 and type 5. Then the next one is investment. Next one is electroformed dyes, which are silver plated, copper plated, in which a polysulfide dye material, a polysulfide impression material is used. Epoxy resins, which are most commonly used in the labs now, and amalgam can be used as a single dye material, flexible dyes, and some refractive dyes are there. So you need to talk about these individual things basing upon the availability of time, but make a note, when you're talking about individual things, the mandatory headings should be advantages and disadvantages. Apart from the basic introduction of the material, you need to write about advantages and disadvantages of all of these materials. So I'm just going to give a brief idea. That is the gypsum products, type 4, type 5, what is the other name of type 4, what is the other name of type 5, what are the advantages of this, what are the disadvantages. As you know that it is more prone to aberration. That is the main disadvantage of gypsum products. So once you're done with this, I hope you remember this gypsum products, which is again a question for the prosto people, in which they need to talk about type 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So in this content, we are going to talk more about 4 and 5, which are used as a dye material. So you need to write about all the water by powder ratio, okay, setting expansion, compressive strength and setting time of all these 4 and 5. Next comes to increase the abrasion resistance of these gypsum products, what can be done? Okay, either you can go for a silver or a copper plated, or you can add a hardener, or you can add some silica which acts as a refractive material, increasing the strength of the material. And the next one is die stone or investment. How, what you're going to do. Okay, all these things you have to learn. Next, as already mentioned, advantages and disadvantages are mandatory for every material. Next, the electroplated dies. Electroplated dies either copper electroplated or either silver electroplated, which is called as electroplating. So in this electroplated dies, apart from mentioning advantages and disadvantages, the other mandatory thing that you have to mention is the system. Okay, the system contains of an anode and a cathode, and a current and an electrolyte solution. Okay, how much current should be used, how much time it should be, and all these things are accessory things that you have to make a note apart from the advantages and disadvantages. The next comes, you can add a note about the properties of electroplated dies. What is die stone if it is used, if it is a copper plated, if it is a silver plated, the things you can add a note, because these tables are going to give more impression. Next is epoxy resin. So epoxy resins are generally a self-cured acrylic material. Again, you have to maintain the advantages and disadvantages. So epoxy resins and die stone, comparison of the properties of epoxy resins and the die stones. Next comes is the refractory dies. Okay, so refractory dies are generally made for the preparation of full ceramic restorations. Okay, so just make a note about all these refractory dies. Amalgam die. Okay, advantages and disadvantages of amalgam die. Followed by the last one is the flexible die material. Okay, they are similar to that of the silicon and polyether impression material. Okay, and make a note about the advantages and disadvantages. Disadvantages, it is more expensive. So at last you need to mention the references, right? So you can add Phillips, you can add the textbook references basically for this, because this is more of a very basic oriented topic, right? So before going for the references, it is better if you add some evidence based stuff. Okay, so article related to the evidence based stuff, as dye materials are more related to prosthetics, this question can be is asked so many times for the endo people also. Okay, very few cases this question was repeated for pedo people, but this question was asked for endo people also. So I'm going to post the reference articles which you can code in evidence based dentistry, a heading before references. Okay, conclusion is how good dye should be, like how should you select a dye. So basing upon the selection of a dye, a simple basic normal logical common sense conclusion is, as none of the dye material follows the ideal properties of dye material what are discussed. Okay, so while selecting a particular case basing upon the material of the restoration, okay, we prefer to go for a particular dye which may give better outcome or a better result and longevity of a restoration, or the crown is also called as restoration, so longevity of a restoration to get a better outcome, right? So this can be linked to evidence based. So this is how you have to conclude it, and followed by you can quote the references. Thank you all. Dr. Srikanth from Team MDSCONQUER. I'll be discussing the part 2 with the dye systems. Okay, different dye systems are there, so I'm just going to discuss them in part 2. Thank you. Take care.